last couple of weeks, we talked about going through why I believe. And this week was set to list out several different scientific arguments for why belief in God makes sense and why it's a logical conclusion to the evidence. But I wanted to take a step back from that and sort of address how we as humans even think. And so I'm going to use the term framework a lot while I'm talking. So I want to explain what it means. And so, like, what is this object? The water bottle. Have you ever seen this specific object before? No, you haven't? You don't know where I got it from? You didn't, but like, it's a very logical conclusion that because this looks like other water bottles you see, it's probably a water bottle, right? That is us operating off of assumed knowledge based on learning and experience. And that's the reason why CAPTCHA tests work, right? When you're trying to log into your email, whatever, some website you haven't gone to for a long time. And it's like, hey, which of these pictures is a street light, right? You just are like, oh, this is boring, that is, right? But a computer can't do that. Because a computer can't work off of assumed information. The computer has to be, this pixel is this gray, this pixel is this gray, this pixel is yellow. Does that mean anything? Well, I don't know. This pixel is also yellow. Now this pixel is red. Is that a street light or is it a taxi cab? I have no idea, right? So this assumed information by which we draw conclusions isn't a faulty way of human thinking. It's one of the ways that humans are able to think so well. When we see something new, we're able to identify it and put it into these frameworks that we operate from. If we were to go, how many people have been to the Cedar Rapids Public Library? Okay. I'm going to pick a different city with less people. How many people have been to the Milwaukee Public Library? Okay, still a person, but we'll go with it, 2 people. Okay, if let's say that for some reason we're all going to Milwaukee, we pull up in front of the library, we all get out of the car, I'm like, hey guys, go inside. What do? You walk through the door, because you recognize that that's a door, and that's how doors work, right? No part of you is like, now here's a structure. Where in the structure is the weakest point for me to enter? Like, no. We process, we filter this information in, and then when we're encountered with new situations, we're able to say, here's information that I have, how does this tie into what I know? And so when I say that a lot of human thinking is based on assumptions, that's not me saying it's a bad thing, because this is how, like, humans are so much more creative than computers. This is why we can do things computers can't. This is why we were even able to make computers, right? So we understand our reality based on these assumed truths. And we don't always learn these truths strictly through experience, but a lot of them we learn because we're taught. So how many people have ever used a hand grenade? A hand grenade. Okay. So, for everyone who has not used a hand grenade, you haven't experienced it. You don't know this because you were taught, or because you went through a process of trial and error of figuring out how a hand grenade works. But you understand that after pulling the pin and throwing it, it will explode dangerously, right? Now, maybe you learned this through watching movies or from video games or from playing on the playground as a kid, but you probably didn't have a teacher sit down and formally go through, here's the schematics of a hand grenade, here's its blast radius, here's the extent of fragmentation will go out, all of that. But that doesn't mean you didn't learn it. That doesn't mean you weren't taught it. It was just more through this process of immersion and culture where this was information that was presented to you. Now, I would wager that most of you have never been near or seen a hand grenade explode, but you know how they work because culturally we've encountered it, and we can internalize that information and learn from it. So what we learn from just what the culture assumes to be true, like hand grenades are dangerous, like we incorporate. Now, I'm setting all of this up because we often just say, oh, this is the stuff that's true, we'll run with that, right? And if it's like a hand grenade, yeah, I've never detonated a hand grenade. I'm gonna trust that they're dangerous and not, go nuts with them. I'm gonna try to avoid exploding grenades in my life. But a lot of times these assumptions are more ingrained and more subtle, and we're not really paying attention to it. Like, the reason I wanted to sort of talk about this instead of scientific proofs for God is because a lot of times we will struggle to fit our understanding of Christianity and the basic understanding of life in the world. And we're like, okay, I'm learning this, and they don't fit. And the truth is, what you're learning outside of church, just in the world, and what you're learning in the church, they don't fit. And it's not because Christianity is just flawed. We just have to give up. It's because we're encountering this framework that assumes certain things, and rather than saying, what is this assuming? And is this assumption true? We're just saying, this doesn't work. And so I really want to get to sort of the notion of what it is to sort of think about things analytically. So because I think that the scientific evidence in support of God really makes sense. It really follows what's scientifically probable based on what knowledge we have. And so rather than just give you the information that may contradict what other people are giving you, I want to instead just break down, what do we do about this conflict? What do we do about intellectual conflict? And so the first, here's a question for you. Like, how many of you have seen 101 Dalmatians or some iteration of it? A few people, 101 Dalmatians. So we have a mental picture of a Dalmatian. What color are purebred Dalmatians? Dalmatians the dog, like the Disney movie 101 Dalmatians. White with black spots. Okay? Does anyone have a problem with that? No? You recognize this? Okay. Now let's say a dog expert comes in and introduces you to a Dalmatian that is white with brown spots. Right, that's one very real conclusion we can come to. The other conclusion we can come to is maybe Dalmatians can have black or brown spots. Now, one of those says, this new information, I'm gonna chuck it out. It's a thing. I'm gonna take this new information, and rather than break down my understanding of this thing, I am just going to disregard this new information. It's a thing. The other one is to say, my understanding of what this is or what this could be, my understanding of Dalmatians is incomplete. And so I need to broaden or change my understanding of Dalmatians to fit this new fact that this dog expert is telling me this is a purebred Dalmatian, even though it's white with brown spots. But we don't do that a lot of times because it's challenging and it's unsettling to say, this is the framework I'm working under, and I'm going to break it down because of new information. That's a lot harder, and that's a lot more difficult than just saying, no, that doesn't agree with the information I already agree with, so I'm not going to engage it. Which is different than engaging with that information and saying, is this information true, and coming to the conclusion that it's not. That is a different process. But so often we're like, this is information that disagrees with what I agree with, so I'm not going to engage it. And we do this as humans, so it's our very natural reaction, but we don't always pause to think, what is it that I am holding to as the framework for reality? Because a lot of times what we hold to for the framework of reality is just what we happen to have been taught through movies, through video games, through playing on the playground, through our parents, through our schools. And it's good to learn, and it's good to learn from people. But to just take anything in without questioning it, and then once you have an idea, refusing to question it further, it's real dangerous. But it's really easy because it's the lazy way. Like, it's the way that you don't have to stretch your mind out. So, just to give some examples of some ideas that are super common in our culture today, is these ideas that we really took hold in the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, like the Spanish Revolution, not the Spanish, the French Revolution. I don't know where Spain even came into. So French Revolution, a lot of this came to the forefront, but there were problems with the church. The church wasn't acting like Christ. The church wasn't representing Christ in the way it should. People were hurt by it. They turned away strongly against it. They were told, believe. Why? Because you're supposed to. Well, what are you doing? Oh, you're not living like Christ. Okay, we can check this then. And some of the ideas that came out of the Enlightenment that we still really hold on to is that, one, there's this stark separation from spiritual things and physical things. When God created us, did he create us? How did he create us? Did we have a soul? Yes. Did we have a body? Yes. Okay. God didn't create us as a soul and be like, you know what? You sinned. I'm going to sick you with the body. Right? And when we die and we go to heaven, it's not like we're in some, angelic spiritual state without a body. It talks about us being recreated, a new creation. And so that, I'm highlighting particularly like the essence of the human, but that's throughout all of sort of culture is, if it's a spiritual thing, it's not a physical thing. If it's a physical thing, it's not a spiritual thing. And that is something that is, within the scope of history, a very modern idea and a very unfounded idea. But it's what society says, so we just assume it. We don't question it. And then when we go to church and we learn about the importance of our hearts, we're like, that must be talking about what the society says is the soul, because it's a separate part of me, because I grew up in this society that says physical things are one thing, spiritual things are another. That's just one example. Another one is that belief and logic or rational thought are totally different. That's not true. Like, how many of you assumed your chair would hold you up? I mean, you're all sitting, so I would assume all of you, right? It's a desire to belittle things that fall outside of the rational framework, that if I disagree with it, I can dismiss it. Because an important thing to realize about these frameworks that you're learning about, or you're experiencing through culture or whatever, is that all of them lead to something. All of them build towards some understanding of reality. And it's not that that's a manipulative process, it's a process of these frameworks. If I understand how to get into the Milwaukee Public Library without having been there before, that's not because architects manipulated me, right? In the same way that if I am going to assume that because it can be genetic change over time, God doesn't exist, that doesn't necessarily mean my biology teacher is trying to manipulate me. But it does mean that the architect is intending for this building to be intuitive. And the biology scientists or whatever are intending for this idea to be understood as truth. So these frameworks all promote this understanding of reality. And what I really want to get to is we can question that, we should question that, we should think about things. And there's really there's no point that a conflict intellectually should lead to dismissal of anything. The conflict intellectually should lead to an investigation. And that often means talking to people who have an idea, working it out, trying to I mean, there's so many different ways to do it. But so often we encounter, hey, here's this one idea that disagrees with what my parents are saying. Here's this other idea which disagrees with what my friends are saying. And I'm just gonna have to choose between them. And that's the easy approach, but it's not the right approach. The right approach is to say, hey, where is the underlying truth in these? And what is the picture I come to from an honest investigation of that? And a lot of times we really stress hey, reading your Bible is important. And it's not because learning about an ancient Israelite king is going to directly change the course of the decision you're going to make at school tomorrow, but it's because you're building up this framework of truth that then helps you process other things, right? If I was to say, hey, somewhere there in this church, there's $100, and the first person to find it gets to keep it, right? You guys would be like, okay, that's cool. But probably half of you wouldn't bother to get up because the church is so big. You're not going to find it. Now, how many different pieces of information, how many different clues could I give you before you start getting up and looking for it? If I was like, oh, it's on this side of the church, just to be clear, there's not $100 on it. But if I was like, oh, it's on this side of the church, you'd be like, okay, maybe. If I'm like, okay, it's in a classroom on this side of the church, well, that narrows it down a fair bit. If I'm like, it's in room 103 on this side of the church, you're probably going there without listening. If I'm like, hey, it's buried in this couch in 103, how many of you would go there, get $100, right? It's the clues are building up because we're learning more and more things that are true about the $100, right? And in the same way, the Bible, we're building it up because we're learning more and more things that are true about God, about reality, about us. But I want to talk a little bit, there's intentionally not a lot of application in this talk because a lot of that is going to be borne out in small groups. But I want to touch on it a little bit in that we talked about hand grenades earlier. What if somebody came up to you and was like, hey Cyrus, hand grenades aren't dangerous, see? And he pulls a pin on a hand grenade missile, right? What would your reaction be? Yeah. All of you would be like, you're insane and dangerous, and I am running. Yeah. But now the reason I ask this is because when people see and people hear that your framework differentiates from the norm, they're going to act like, they're going to assume that you're not in touch with reality. Because a lot of the people around you just accept the framework of society, just sort of puts out there. They don't question it. And the idea that if someone disagrees with the framework, it's because they don't understand reality. In the same way that the person with the grenade who pulled the pin doesn't understand grenades, doesn't understand how dangerous they are. There's no point where you're like, that guy, he gets it. No, he doesn't get it. And that is people's assumption every time someone firmly believes something that contradicts their framework. And so the reason I bring that up is because it can be really hard when you're the one really asking the question of, is this a true assumption? Is this true? And if you come to a different conclusion, like some of my friends disregard my religious beliefs because they think that the framework of buying into this is antiquated and shows a lack of intellect. And for some of them, it's kind of been interesting because it started out as like, oh, he's a good guy, but he's a Christian, so I can probably write off his intelligence. And then they get to know me and they're like, he's a good guy, and I don't understand him, right? That sort of transition of them seeing that that assumption isn't true about me, that I actually think about things deeply, that I actually work things through, that I actually don't accept things just based on being told, but I actually ask, is this a logically true thing that fits into a framework of truth? And so it can be really hard to go to school when your framework is so different than your peers, because you go to share it to them and they're like, dude, you have like, that doesn't make sense, that doesn't get it, like you're off about this. Your description of reality isn't my understanding of reality. And it's easier to assume you're wrong than completely rework my reality based on what you are telling me when I don't even know if what you're telling me is true. And so the reason I wanted to come with that is because this is such an important part of thinking. And thinking is such an important part of living that any description of scientific evidence for the reason of God would fall flat without an understanding of how do we deal with like contradictory ideas, because I'll give you scientific evidences for God, and your science teacher will give you scientific evidences that there doesn't need to be a God. And like, where does that meet? So a lot of this sort of want to leave it pretty open for you guys to dive into whatever you need to in your small groups, which we will now break into. So if you remember where you went previously, just do that. If you don't, follow the friends.
Sweet. Okay, I